The story of the last emperor of China is one that straddles history, culture, and tragedy. Puyi, the final ruler of the Qing dynasty, is a figure who embodies the collapse of imperial China and the rise of the modern era. His life was marked by privilege and power, yet it was also constrained by isolation, manipulation, and circumstance. Born into the most elaborate court in the world, he inherited a title of immense importance. Yet the world around him was changing at a pace faster than any emperor could control. Understanding Puyi's story requires a look not only at the man himself, but at the society he was born into, the forces that shaped him, and the turbulent times through which he lived. China in the early 20th century was a nation on the edge of transformation. For centuries, emperors had ruled with near-absolute authority, maintaining social order and controlling every aspect of public and private life. The Qing dynasty, established in the 17th century, had endured numerous challenges, both internal and external. By the time Puyi was born, the dynasty was in decline, weakened by corruption, foreign invasions, and internal rebellions. The world outside the Forbidden City was changing rapidly. Western powers had forced China to open its ports, and foreign ideas, technologies, and political systems were slowly seeping into the imperial state. Amid these changes, the emperor remained a symbol of continuity, yet the foundation of his authority was eroding. Puyi was born into this tension. From the very beginning, his life was shaped by tradition and ceremony. He was chosen as emperor at the tender age of 2, a decision dictated not by his personal abilities, but by the circumstances of succession and the intricate rules of court politics. The significance of this choice cannot be overstated. In a society that placed supreme value on the emperor as the son of heaven, Puyi's selection represented both the continuity of centuries of rule and the fragility of the institution he represented. Despite his youth, he was expected to embody the wisdom and authority of an adult ruler, even though he had no capacity to make real decisions. The palace walls became both his home and his prison, and his daily life was governed by strict rituals and the oversight of officials, eunuchs, and advisors. What makes Puyi's story compelling is the contrast between the power he inherited and the control he actually had. As a child emperor, he was surrounded by grandeur, adorned in robes of gold and silk, and attended by an army of servants and advisors. Yet, in reality, he wielded almost no political influence. Decisions were made for him, and he was shielded from the broader world that would soon determine the fate of his dynasty. This paradox, a ruler without real authority, would define much of his life, shaping his understanding of power, responsibility, and identity. Even as he sat on the throne, the dynasty he represented was slipping away, and the historical forces around him were moving toward a world in which emperors were no longer central to the governance of China. Puyi's life also offers a window into the human experience of historical upheaval. He experienced isolation, fear, and uncertainty from an early age. He faced expectations that no child could fulfill and witnessed the decline of traditions that had governed his world for centuries. Yet his story is not only one of loss. It is also a story of adaptation and survival. Puyi lived through revolution, foreign occupation, war, imprisonment, and political transformation. He moved from being the center of the world in the Forbidden City to a prisoner of the Soviets and later a citizen in communist China. Each stage of his life reflects broader historical shifts, and his experiences provide a personal lens through which to understand the transformation of an entire nation. The fascination with Puyi also stems from the dramatic contrast between image and reality. To the outside world, he was the emperor, a symbol of China's ancient authority. Within the palace, he was a child learning to navigate a complex web of tradition and expectation. Later, as a puppet ruler under Japanese control, he was a figurehead caught between the demands of foreign powers and the remnants of his imperial identity. Finally, in the later years of his life, he became a citizen among citizens, stripped of titles and privileges, forced to reconcile his past with a new social and political reality. His story is a reminder that history is not only shaped by grand events, but also by the personal lives of those who experience them. In the story of the last emperor, it becomes clear that Puyi's life is more than a historical curiosity. It is a narrative that captures the tension between tradition and modernity, authority and powerlessness, personal ambition and historical forces. It asks questions about the meaning of identity, the role of symbolism in politics, and the human cost of political change. For viewers, Puyi's life provides a compelling exploration of the last days of imperial China, offering both insight and empathy. His story is a bridge between past and present, illustrating how individuals navigate the sweep of history and reminding us that even those at the pinnacle of power are subject to the forces beyond their control. Before the birth of the last emperor, China had already entered a long period of strain and uncertainty. The Qing dynasty, founded in 1644 by the Manchu rulers, had once been a strong and confident empire. It expanded China's borders, maintained internal stability, and oversaw centuries of cultural development. For a long time, the imperial system appeared unshakable. The emperor stood at the center of the political universe, believed to rule by the mandate of heaven. This belief linked moral authority with political power, creating the idea that as long as an emperor governed wisely, heaven would support his rule. Yet by the 19th century, this system was under growing pressure, and the signs of decline became increasingly hard to ignore. Internally, the Qing state struggled with corruption and inefficiency. As the population grew, the government failed to adapt its administrative systems to manage the expanding demands of society. Many officials gained their positions through family connections rather than merit, and bribery became common at all levels of government. The examination system, once a source of capable administrators, began to lose effectiveness as it emphasized classical knowledge over practical governance. This disconnect weakened the state's ability to respond to crises, whether they were economic, social, or military. Peasant unrest increased as land became scarce, taxes remained heavy, and natural disasters were poorly managed. For ordinary people, the image of the emperor as a benevolent ruler felt increasingly distant from daily reality. External pressure further exposed the Qing dynasty's weaknesses. Western powers, driven by trade interests and industrial strength, forced their way into China through a series of conflicts known as the Opium Wars. These wars revealed how outdated China's military and naval forces had become. Defeats at the hands of Britain and later other foreign nations led to humiliating treaties that stripped China of territory, imposed heavy financial penalties, and granted foreign powers special rights within Chinese cities. Ports were opened to foreign trade, missionaries gained access to the interior, and Chinese sovereignty was steadily eroded. These concessions deeply damaged the prestige of the Qing government and undermined the traditional belief that China stood at the center of the world. The impact of foreign influence went beyond military defeat. Western ideas about science, governance, and social organization began to spread among educated elites. Some Chinese scholars and officials recognized that reform was necessary if the empire was to survive. Attempts were made to modernize the military, introduce new industries, and reform education. However, these efforts were often limited and inconsistent. Conservative factions within the court resisted change, fearing that reform would weaken traditional values and undermine imperial authority. As a result, China's modernization lagged behind that of other nations facing similar pressures, leaving the Qing state caught between tradition and necessity. At the same time, internal rebellions shook the empire to its core. The Taiping Rebellion, which erupted in the mid-19th century, was one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. It challenged Qing authority across vast regions of China and caused immense destruction and loss of life. Although the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it left the empire financially exhausted and politically weakened. Other uprisings followed, reflecting widespread dissatisfaction with imperial rule. These movements showed that loyalty to the dynasty was no longer guaranteed, and that the social contract between ruler and ruled was breaking down. The imperial court itself became a symbol of stagnation and division. Power struggles among officials, regents, and members of the imperial family created an atmosphere of mistrust and paralysis. Empress Dowager Cixi, one of the most powerful figures in late Qing politics, dominated the court for decades. While she was a skilled political survivor, her rule was often criticized for prioritizing personal power over meaningful reform. Decisions were frequently driven by short-term concerns rather than long-term stability. This environment made it difficult for the dynasty to present a unified response to the challenges it faced, further weakening its position. By the turn of the 20th century, revolutionary ideas had begun to gain traction. Intellectuals and activists questioned the very foundations of imperial rule. Influenced by Western political thought and frustrated by the failures of reform, they argued that China needed a new system altogether. Figures such as Sun Yat-sen promoted republicanism, nationalism, and modernization as alternatives to monarchy. Secret societies, reform groups, and revolutionary organizations spread these ideas across China and among overseas Chinese communities. Although these movements were initially small, they tapped into deep frustrations within society and gradually gained momentum. The imperial system also struggled with its own rigid structure. Succession crises and regencies often placed children on the throne, leaving real power in the hands of advisors and relatives. While this arrangement was meant to preserve continuity, it often resulted in weak leadership during critical moments. The symbolic importance of the emperor remained strong, but the practical ability of the throne to govern effectively diminished. This gap between symbolism and reality became more pronounced as China faced increasingly complex problems that required decisive and informed leadership. As the Qing dynasty entered its final years, it attempted a last round of reforms, including plans for a constitutional monarchy. These measures came too late to restore confidence in imperial rule. Many reformers viewed them as superficial, while conservatives feared they went too far. The result was widespread dissatisfaction on all sides. The dynasty appeared unable to fully embrace modernization or defend traditional authority. This failure created a political vacuum, setting the stage for revolutionary change. It was into this unstable and uncertain world that Puyi was born. The empire he inherited was already hollowed out, its authority questioned at home and abroad. The grandeur of the Forbidden City and the elaborate rituals of the court masked a system that was struggling to survive. Understanding this context is essential to understanding Puyi's life. He was not simply the last emperor because of personal weakness or misfortune. He was the last emperor because the system he represented had reached the end of its historical path. His reign, brief and symbolic, marked the final chapter of a political tradition that had shaped China for over 2,000 years. Puyi was born on February 7, 1906, into a world defined by strict hierarchy, ritual, and inherited power. His family belonged to the Aisanjoro clan, the ruling house of the Qing dynasty. Although imperial blood ran through his veins, his early life did not initially mark him as someone destined to sit on the throne. He was born in Beijing, not in the Forbidden City itself, but in the residence of his father, Prince Chun. His infancy followed the patterns of aristocratic life rather than imperial destiny. Yet political circumstance, not personal choice, would soon place him at the center of an empire already on the brink of collapse. Puyi's selection as emperor came suddenly and without warning. In 1908, the Guangxu Emperor and Empress Dowager Cixi both died within days of each other. Their deaths created an urgent succession crisis. The Qing court, fearful of instability and bound by rigid traditions, needed a new emperor quickly. Puyi, only 2 years old, was chosen largely because of his lineage and because his youth made him easier to control. He was summoned to the Forbidden City, taken from his parents with little explanation, and thrust into a role he could not possibly understand. According to later accounts, his first memories of the palace were filled with fear, confusion, and constant crying, a response not uncommon for a child suddenly removed from familiar surroundings. From the moment he entered the Forbidden City, Puyi's life changed completely. The palace was not merely a residence, but a closed world governed by strict rules and elaborate customs. Thousands of servants, eunuchs, guards, and officials maintained its daily operations. Every movement was regulated, every interaction shaped by rank and protocol. As emperor, Puyi was treated with extreme deference. Adults bowed before him, avoided direct eye contact, and followed rigid ceremonial behavior. Yet this outward respect masked a deeper reality. He was isolated, closely monitored, and largely powerless. Decisions about his life, education, and behavior were made by others, often without his knowledge or consent. Education played a central role in Puyi's upbringing, though it followed traditional imperial patterns rather than modern methods. He was taught classical Chinese texts, moral philosophy, and Confucian principles meant to shape him into a proper ruler. Lessons emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and ritual correctness. Tutors demanded discipline and perfection, and punishment for mistakes could be harsh. Physical punishment was common, reinforcing fear rather than understanding. This form of education left little room for emotional development or independent thought. While Puyi learned to recite ancient texts, he struggled to understand the world beyond palace walls. Life inside the Forbidden City was marked by contradiction. On one hand, Puyi lived in extreme luxury. He wore finely crafted robes, ate elaborate meals prepared by palace kitchens, and occupied halls filled with priceless art and furnishings. On the other hand, he lived in emotional isolation. He had no normal friendships, no siblings nearby, and little contact with his parents. His mother died when he was still young, further deepening his sense of abandonment. The people closest to him were eunuchs and servants, many of whom sought to gain favor or power through manipulation. This environment made it difficult for him to trust others or develop healthy relationships. Despite his youth, Puyi was made aware of his special status from an early age. He was taught that he was the son of heaven, the link between the human world and the divine order. This belief placed enormous psychological pressure on a child who barely understood its meaning. At the same time, his actual authority was almost non-existent. Regents and senior officials made all major decisions, while he served as a symbolic figurehead. This gap between expectation and reality created confusion and frustration that would follow him throughout his life. Discipline within the palace was severe, but it was unevenly applied. While Puyi could punish servants harshly for minor offenses, he himself was subject to strict control by those around him. This imbalance distorted his understanding of power and responsibility. He learned that authority could be arbitrary and that fear was an effective tool for control. At the same time, he remained emotionally dependent on those who guided him, even when their guidance was self-serving or cruel. These early experiences shaped his later behavior, contributing to moments of cruelty, insecurity, and emotional instability. The Forbidden City also shielded Puyi from the realities of the outside world. While China faced political unrest, reform movements, and growing revolutionary sentiment, the palace remained largely unchanged. Traditional rituals continued as they had for centuries, creating the illusion of stability. Puyi grew up unaware of the depth of the crisis facing the Qing dynasty. When news of unrest did reach him, it was often filtered or softened by officials who wished to protect their own positions. This isolation left him unprepared for the dramatic changes that would soon strip him of his throne. Even as a child, Puyi showed signs of frustration with his constrained life. He struggled with temper and emotional outbursts, often reacting strongly to perceived slights or restrictions. These behaviors were not unusual for a child in his position, yet they were amplified by the environment in which he lived. There was little room for emotional expression or comfort. Compassion was secondary to protocol, and mistakes were rarely met with understanding. As a result, Puyi learned to suppress vulnerability while asserting control where he could. By the time Puyi reached early childhood, the foundations of his life had already been set. He was emperor in name, prisoner in practice, and a child shaped by forces far beyond his control. His early years inside the Forbidden City laid the groundwork for the conflicts that would define his later life. Raised to believe in absolute authority yet denied real power, surrounded by luxury yet deprived of emotional security, Puyi entered history not as a ruler prepared for leadership, but as a symbol burdened by expectations he could never fulfill. His childhood was not simply the beginning of a reign, but the beginning of a lifelong struggle to understand who he was in a world that no longer needed an emperor. Puyi's coronation was both a grand spectacle and a deeply symbolic moment, reflecting the weight of centuries of imperial tradition even as the system itself was nearing collapse. Though he was only 2 years old, the ceremony followed the established rituals that had been used for generations of emperors. The Forbidden City became the stage for this event, its vast halls and courtyards prepared to display the continuity and authority of the Qing dynasty. For the officials who organized the ceremony, the goal was clear: to present an image of stability and legitimacy to a nation already showing signs of unrest. The age of the emperor did not matter as much as the preservation of form, ritual, and symbolism. The coronation took place in an atmosphere of tension and urgency. With the deaths of both the Guangxu Emperor and Empress Dowager Cixi, the court was anxious to secure succession quickly. Any delay risked inviting political instability or challenges to imperial authority. As a result, preparations were rushed, even as they adhered strictly to tradition. Puyi, dressed in ceremonial robes that were heavy and restrictive, was carried through the palace by attendants. He did not understand the meaning of the rituals unfolding around him. Later in life, he recalled the event not as a moment of glory, but as one filled with fear, confusion, and exhaustion. The The sounds, the crowds, and the rigid formality overwhelmed him, and his cries echoed through halls meant to project divine authority. The ceremony itself was rich in symbolism. Every movement, gesture, and object carried meaning rooted in Confucian philosophy and imperial custom. The throne represented the center of the universe, with the emperor acting as the intermediary between heaven and earth. Officials prostrated themselves in formal bows, reaffirming their loyalty and acknowledging the sacred nature of imperial rule. To outside observers, this display suggested continuity and order. Yet beneath the surface, many within the court understood that the power of the throne was weakening. The coronation, though impressive, could not erase the political and social forces threatening the dynasty. Because Puyi was a child, real authority rested with regents and senior officials. His father, Prince Chun, initially served as regent, though his influence was limited by internal court politics. The regency system was meant to ensure stability until the emperor came of age, but in practice it often led to factional struggles and indecision. Different groups within the court sought to shape policy and protect their interests, sometimes at the expense of effective governance. Puyi, seated on the throne, became a symbol rather than a decision-maker. His presence legitimized the actions of others, even when those actions failed to address the empire's deeper problems. Public perception of the coronation varied. For traditionalists, the ceremony reaffirmed the sacred order that had governed China for centuries. The idea of a child emperor was not new in Chinese history, and many believed that heaven would guide the dynasty through this period of transition. For reformers and revolutionaries, however, the coronation highlighted the weaknesses of the imperial system. A toddler on the throne symbolized a government out of touch with reality, clinging to ritual while the nation faced foreign pressure, economic hardship, and calls for political change. To them, the ceremony was less a sign of strength and more evidence of decline. Within the palace, life after the coronation continued much as before, though Puyi's status was now clearly defined. He was addressed with the highest titles, his movements were further restricted, and his daily routine became even more structured. He was expected to sit through formal audiences, observe rituals, and maintain the appearance of dignity, despite his age. These expectations placed an emotional burden on him that few around him acknowledged. Rather than being guided gently, he was often treated as an object of ceremony, valued more for what he represented than for who he was. The coronation also marked the beginning of Puyi's gradual separation from any sense of normal childhood. While other children learned through play and exploration, his world was defined by rules and observation. Mistakes during ceremonies could result in punishment for servants or reprimands for himself, reinforcing the idea that his behavior carried serious consequences. This awareness fostered anxiety and frustration, emotions he struggled to express openly. The palace environment discouraged emotional vulnerability, favoring discipline and control instead. At the same time, the coronation strengthened the illusion of permanence within the Forbidden City. For those living inside its walls, daily rituals continued to affirm the emperor's central role. Seasonal ceremonies, ancestral worship, and court protocols reinforced the idea that the dynasty still governed China. This illusion delayed meaningful adaptation to the changing political landscape. While reformers outside the palace debated constitutions and republican ideals, the court focused on preserving tradition. Puyi, as the newly crowned emperor, became the focal point of this resistance to change, even though he had no say in the matter. As the years passed, the memory of the coronation took on a different meaning for Puyi. In his later reflections, he described it not as a moment of pride, but as the start of a life defined by confinement. The grandeur he was meant to embody became a reminder of his lack of freedom. The throne, which symbolized ultimate authority, became a seat of isolation. The cheers and formal declarations that accompanied his rise contrasted sharply with the loneliness that followed. The coronation of Puyi stands as one of the final great imperial ceremonies in Chinese history. It marked the last time the Qing dynasty attempted to assert its ancient authority through ritual alone. While the event followed tradition to the smallest detail, it could not conceal the reality that China was changing in ways the imperial system could no longer control. Puyi's coronation did not signal renewal but closure. It was a ceremonial echo of a fading world, one last assertion of continuity before the foundations of imperial rule gave way. For Puyi himself, it was the beginning of a journey shaped by forces he neither understood nor commanded, a journey that would carry him far from the throne he was too young to comprehend. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries, faced its final collapse during Puyi's early childhood. By the early 20th century, the dynasty was a fragile shell of its former power, struggling to maintain control over a vast empire while responding to unprecedented internal and external pressures. The challenges it faced were both systemic and immediate. Internally, widespread corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency had weakened the central government, leaving local officials to manage crises with little oversight. Heavy taxation and land shortages caused social unrest, while repeated famines and floods exacerbated the suffering of the population. Ordinary citizens were increasingly disillusioned with a regime that appeared more concerned with maintaining court rituals than addressing pressing social and economic problems. Externally, China's sovereignty was under constant threat. Foreign powers had long forced China to make concessions through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic coercion. The Opium Wars in the 19th century, followed by a series of unequal treaties, had ceded territory to Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan. These treaties also imposed significant financial burdens on the empire and allowed foreign powers to exercise extraterritorial privileges, undermining Chinese law and governance. By the early 1900s, China was essentially being carved into spheres of influence, each dominated by a foreign power. The Qing government, which had once projected an aura of invincible authority, now struggled to assert even basic control over its own territory. In 1911, tensions erupted into full-scale revolution. The Wuchang Uprising, which began in October of that year, marked the beginning of the Xinhai Revolution, a nationwide revolt against imperial rule. The uprising spread rapidly, fueled by widespread dissatisfaction with the dynasty and inspired by revolutionary groups such as the Tongmenghui, led by Sun Yat-sen. The revolutionaries called for the end of the monarchy, the establishment of a republic, and the modernization of China along Western lines. For many in the countryside and the cities, the Qing dynasty had become a symbol of stagnation, corruption, and weakness, and the revolutionary message resonated deeply with a population desperate for change. The court faced a crisis it could not control. Puyi, still a child, was the nominal emperor, but he had no capacity to influence events. The regents and senior officials debated how to respond, but their indecision and factional disputes weakened any potential resistance. Some advisors argued for military suppression of the revolution, while others favored negotiation to preserve at least some elements of the dynasty. The lack of coherent strategy revealed the depth of the dynasty's decline. The emperor himself was largely invisible to the population. The monarchy was represented more by tradition and ceremony than by actual authority or leadership. Negotiations between revolutionary forces and the Qing court eventually led to a compromise. In February 1912, the young Puyi formally abdicated the throne, marking the official end of imperial rule in China. The abdication was largely symbolic. It was a recognition that the dynasty could no longer govern effectively. The terms allowed Puyi to retain certain privileges, including the use of the Forbidden City, a stipend, and maintenance of his personal status. These concessions were designed to ease the transition and prevent further violence, but they could not restore the power or prestige that the throne had once commanded. The abdication effectively ended over 2,000 years of imperial rule, a system that had shaped Chinese society, culture, and politics for millennia. The abdication of the Qing dynasty was more than a political event. It was a profound social and cultural rupture. For centuries, the emperor had been seen as the son of heaven, the moral and spiritual center of Chinese life. The fall of the dynasty challenged deeply held beliefs about authority, legitimacy, and the relationship between ruler and people. Ordinary citizens, officials, and intellectuals alike had to confront the reality of a China without an emperor. For some, this represented liberation and the possibility of progress. For others, it was a profound loss, a severing of traditions that had structured life for generations. For Puyi, the abdication was a personal as well as political event. Though he was too young to fully understand the significance, the loss of power and responsibility marked the end of his role as a ruling emperor and the beginning of a life defined by uncertainty and adaptation. He retained his imperial title and name, but the trappings of authority no longer carried real meaning. Life in the Forbidden City continued, but the palace became a symbol of what had been lost rather than a center of governance. The young emperor was forced to navigate a complex world in which his status was both honored and meaningless, a contradiction that would shape much of his later life. The fall of the Qing dynasty also set the stage for the turbulent decades that followed. The abdication did not bring stability to China. Instead, the country entered a period of fragmentation, dominated by regional warlords, foreign interference, and competing visions of governance. Republican ideals clashed with traditional loyalties, while revolutionary and reformist movements sought to redefine the nation's future. The experience of the abdication and the recognition that the throne no longer commanded authority left Puyi caught between two worlds: the ceremonial grandeur of the past and the unpredictable realities of modern China. The end of the Qing dynasty was a pivotal moment not only for China, but also for the world. It marked the transition from a millennia-old system of monarchy to a nation-state facing the challenges of modern governance. For historians and observers, it illustrates the limits of symbolic power when detached from practical authority. For Puyi, it was the beginning of a life that would continue to reflect this tension between image and reality, between inherited status and real influence. His abdication may have been formalized through negotiation and ceremony, but it represented a fundamental shift in the trajectory of Chinese history and the destiny of its last emperor. After the abdication of the Qing dynasty in 1912, Puyi remained in the Forbidden City, but his life changed in ways that were subtle yet profound. While he retained his title and continued to live in the luxurious palace, the authority he once symbolized had vanished. He was no longer the ruler of an empire, but a ceremonial figure, a living reminder of a bygone era. Life inside the walls continued to follow centuries-old rituals, yet the emperor who had once been the center of power now had no real influence over the decisions that shaped the country beyond the palace gates. This period, though seemingly calm, was filled with isolation, political maneuvering, and the slow realization of his powerlessness. Daily life in the Forbidden City after abdication remained rigidly structured. Puyi's mornings began with elaborate rituals, including prayers, offerings, and the inspection of palace grounds. Tutors continued to instruct him, focusing on Confucian texts, calligraphy, and classical Chinese history. These lessons were meant to maintain the skills and knowledge of an emperor, even though the application of these skills in governance was no longer relevant. Eunuchs and palace officials maintained meticulous order, overseeing every aspect of his life, from meals to attire. Every action he took was observed, and strict etiquette continued to govern interactions, reinforcing the sense that while he was no longer a ruler, he was still to be treated with the deference reserved for a monarch. Despite the outward routine, the reality of his situation weighed heavily on him. Puyi had inherited an immense title and wealth, but lacked the freedom or authority to exercise it. He was effectively a prisoner within his own home, confined to a palace that was both protective and restrictive. The Forbidden City, once a symbol of absolute power, became a gilded cage. The young emperor had to navigate a complex social hierarchy within the palace, balancing relationships with regents, advisors, and eunuchs, many of whom were more concerned with their own influence than with his well-being. This environment created a sense of mistrust, as Puyi learned early that loyalty was conditional and often self-serving. The isolation of palace life became more pronounced as the years passed. Puyi had few peers within the Forbidden City. While he occasionally interacted with visiting dignitaries or relatives, most of his companions were adults who treated him either with exaggerated reverence or stern discipline. The lack of normal social interaction contributed to a sense of emotional detachment. He was aware of the outside world, of course, and rumors of political unrest, warlord disputes, and social change filtered in through advisors or palace servants. However, these accounts were often incomplete or biased, leaving him with a distorted understanding of the rapid transformation occurring beyond the palace walls. The psychological effects of this confinement were significant. Puyi struggled with feelings of loneliness and frustration, emotions that were compounded by the contradictions of his position. He was treated as a sacred figure, yet he had no control over his life. He was expected to display dignity and wisdom, yet he was still a child with the emotional needs and limitations of youth. Punishments and scoldings were sometimes administered for behaviors that in other contexts would have been normal, teaching him that error could have serious consequences, even in a world where his authority was largely symbolic. These experiences would shape his personality, making him simultaneously cautious, insecure, and at times resentful of those around him. Life in the Forbidden City also reinforced a sense of historical continuity and tradition. Despite the abdication, the palace remained a living museum of imperial culture. Rituals for ancestral worship continued, festivals were celebrated with all the pomp of previous centuries, and palace officials maintained strict adherence to ceremonial protocol. For Puyi, this created a paradoxical existence. He was the last emperor of a fallen dynasty, yet he lived as if the monarchy remained intact. The contrast between the grandeur of the ceremonies and the reality of his diminished power heightened his awareness of the fragility of authority. During this period, Puyi also experienced early exposure to the outside political world, though it was limited and carefully controlled. Court officials occasionally discussed developments in the fledgling Republic of China, foreign diplomacy, and internal uprisings. These conversations were filtered, with information chosen to protect the young emperor from distressing truths or to influence his perception of events. Despite these restrictions, Puyi began to understand that the symbolic power of the throne could not protect him from the broader forces reshaping China. The realization that his imperial title carried prestige, but little practical significance, was a subtle but growing awareness that would inform his decisions in later life. Family dynamics played a significant role in his daily life. Puyi's father, Prince Chun, remained involved in palace affairs, but his influence was limited by court politics and the complex relationships among officials. Puyi's relationships with palace tutors and advisors were similarly complicated. They combined instruction with surveillance, often prioritizing political loyalty over personal care. The young emperor had to learn how to navigate these relationships carefully, discerning motives and balancing obedience with subtle resistance. His ability to survive and maintain status in this environment required careful observation, memory, and social acuity, skills he honed over years of palace life. Despite the constraints, Puyi's life in the Forbidden City after abdication was not entirely without comfort. The palace offered luxury and protection, a stark contrast to the uncertainty and violence that affected much of China at the time. Meals were lavish, clothing was of the highest quality, and the surroundings were unparalleled in beauty. Yet this comfort was inseparable from confinement. The same walls that provided safety also prevented freedom, reinforcing a sense of being trapped within a world that no longer aligned with reality. This period also sowed the seeds for Puyi's later political and personal struggles. The combination of isolation, ritualized authority, and emotional detachment created a pattern that would influence his interactions with those around him, from Japanese officials to communist authorities. His understanding of power remained tied to ceremony rather than practical governance, a perspective that would both limit him and make him vulnerable in the years to come. The paradox of ceremonial prestige without practical authority became a defining feature of his identity. Living in the Forbidden City after abdication was therefore a complex and contradictory experience. It was a time of privilege, ritual, and education, but it was also a period of confinement, emotional strain, and exposure to a fragile and changing world. Puyi existed in a liminal space, simultaneously a relic of imperial China and a participant in the new era of republican governance. This environment shaped his character, prepared him for later political manipulation, and left an enduring mark on his understanding of power, duty, and personal identity. After the abdication, Puyi's position as the former emperor became a focal point for political intrigue and restoration efforts, even though he was still a child. Many factions within China remained loyal to the Qing dynasty and sought opportunities to restore it to power. These monarchist groups were composed of former officials, aristocrats, and military leaders who were dissatisfied with the republican government. They believed that the monarchy provided stability and continuity, and they hoped to place Puyi back on the throne either as a symbolic figurehead or as a ruling emperor. For the young Puyi, these efforts were largely invisible at first, but they would later shape his understanding of politics and his own role in a rapidly changing China. The first significant attempt at restoration occurred in 1917, when General Zhang Sun, a staunch monarchist, tried to reinstate the Qing dynasty in a short-lived coup. Zhang believed that by returning Puyi to the throne, he could restore the empire and reassert imperial authority over the country. For a brief period, Puyi was proclaimed emperor once more, though he remained a passive participant in these events. At just 11 years old, he had little understanding of the political maneuvering around him. The restoration lasted only 12 days before Republican forces regained control, ending the attempt and leaving Puyi and his supporters humiliated. This episode revealed both the fragility of monarchist power and the inability of the young emperor to assert authority without external backing. Throughout these years, Puyi remained under the watchful eyes of palace officials, advisors, and regents who carefully managed his interactions with the outside world. Some of these figures had personal ambitions and sought to influence him for their own gain, presenting him with selective information or manipulating events behind the scenes. The young emperor was often caught between competing interests, forced to navigate a complex web of loyalty, intrigue, and deception. Though he had no real power, the responsibility of maintaining the image of the emperor placed him at the center of schemes that could have far-reaching consequences. Political instability outside the palace only compounded these challenges. China in the 1910s and 1920s was fragmented, with regional warlords controlling much of the country. The central Republican government struggled to assert authority, and various revolutionary factions vied for influence. This environment made the idea of restoring the monarchy appealing to some groups who longed for a clear hierarchy and traditional governance. Monarchist sympathizers argued that a child emperor like Puyi could be guided by trusted advisors, creating a stable government while satisfying Republican critics. In reality, however, these plans relied entirely on the ambitions and loyalties of others rather than any initiative from Puyi himself. During this period, Puyi's life continued to oscillate between the ceremonial grandeur of the palace and the uncertainty of political maneuvering outside it. While he lived in the luxurious surroundings of the Forbidden City, he was increasingly aware that the world beyond its walls was dangerous, unpredictable, and often hostile. Advisors and family members carefully shielded him from news that might be disturbing, yet he gradually absorbed an understanding of his symbolic importance. Even as a child, he realized that he represented more than himself. He was the living embodiment of a dynasty that still inspired loyalty and fear. This realization created both pride and anxiety, shaping his emerging sense of identity. Relations with the Republican government were another critical factor in this period. While some officials were willing to tolerate Puyi's continued presence in the Forbidden City, they remained wary of restoration attempts. Agreements allowed him to live in the palace and maintain certain privileges, but these arrangements were contingent on his political neutrality. Republican leaders feared that any sign of imperial resurgence could destabilize their fragile authority, and they closely monitored monarchist activities. For Puyi, this meant that even ceremonial gestures could carry political weight, adding pressure to his daily life and interactions with palace officials. Efforts to manipulate or influence Puyi were not limited to Chinese actors. Foreign powers, particularly Japan, began to view him as a potential tool for advancing their interests in the region. They recognized that the young emperor's symbolic authority could be exploited to lend legitimacy to political schemes in northern China and Manchuria. While these efforts were not immediate, they set the stage for later events in which Puyi would become a pawn in larger geopolitical strategies. The seeds of foreign manipulation were planted during this period, reflecting the vulnerability of a figure who had status but no real control. The psychological impact of these restoration attempts on Puyi was significant. He experienced repeated cycles of hope and disappointment as monarchist factions made promises or staged events that temporarily elevated his status. Each failed attempt reinforced the reality that his position was dependent on others' ambitions and the instability of the broader political environment. At the same time, he began to internalize lessons about power, authority, and survival. The young emperor learned that appearances mattered more than actual influence, and that loyalty was often conditional and self-serving. These lessons would influence his later decisions during his time as a puppet ruler under Japanese occupation. By the early 1920s, it became clear that large-scale restoration was unlikely. The Republican government had consolidated enough authority to prevent major monarchist uprisings, and China's internal divisions made coordinated action difficult. Puyi remained in the Forbidden City, his life shaped as much by ritual and ceremony as by politics. The failed attempts at restoration, however, left an enduring mark. They demonstrated that while the monarchy could no longer govern, it retained symbolic power that could be leveraged by those with ambition. Puyi's position as the last emperor made him both a target and a tool, a status that would define his life in the years to come. This period of attempted restorations highlights the contradictions of Puyi's life. He was revered yet powerless, central to political schemes yet excluded from decision-making. The gap between ceremonial authority and practical control widened, creating tension that would persist throughout his life. Even as a young boy, Puyi had to reconcile the prestige of his title with the reality of his dependence on others, a lesson that would resonate when he faced foreign manipulation, political exile, and eventual reintegration into a modern China. After years of ceremonial existence within the Forbidden City and failed attempts at restoration, Puyi's life took a dramatic turn with the rise of Japanese influence in Manchuria. In the early 1930s, Japan sought to expand its control over the region, both for strategic and economic reasons. The Japanese military and government recognized that Puyi, with his imperial lineage, could serve as a useful instrument for legitimizing their ambitions. They envisioned him as the figurehead of a new state, one that would appear independent but remain firmly under Japanese control. For Puyi, this period marked the transition from symbolic power within a closed palace to a carefully orchestrated role on the international stage, though his real authority remained limited. In 1932, with Japanese support, Puyi was installed as the Emperor of Manchukuo, a puppet state in northeastern China. The ceremony echoed many of the rituals he had known as a child, with elaborate robes, formal processions, and strict ceremonial protocols. Yet the context was entirely different. Whereas his early coronation was meant to uphold the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty, this new enthronement served the strategic goals of a foreign power. Puyi's presence lent historical and cultural credibility to a government that lacked popular support. He was elevated to the throne once more, but the power he exercised was largely illusory. Decisions regarding governance, military action, and foreign relations were made by Japanese officials, leaving him as a symbolic ruler without genuine influence. Life in Manchukuo was marked by a combination of luxury, surveillance, and restriction. Puyi lived in palaces that were carefully designed to mirror the grandeur of the Forbidden City, complete with ceremonial halls, gardens, and attendants. The Japanese ensured that he appeared regal to the local population and foreign observers. However, this opulence masked a deeper reality. He was under constant supervision, with Japanese advisors controlling nearly every aspect of his daily routine. Puyi's movements were monitored, and his interactions were often scripted. The emperor had status, but it came at the cost of personal freedom, echoing the limitations he had experienced as a child in Beijing. The political manipulation Puyi faced in Manchukuo was extensive. Japanese officials sought to shape him into a compliant figure who could be used to advance their agenda. Advisors dictated policy positions, guided his speeches, and controlled public appearances. Puyi was instructed to endorse laws, policies, and propaganda that aligned with Japanese interests, regardless of his personal beliefs. His symbolic authority was thus harnessed to create the appearance of sovereignty while real power remained in foreign hands. The psychological impact of this manipulation was profound. Puyi struggled to reconcile his status as emperor with the recognition that he was essentially a puppet, a tool for the ambitions of others. Despite these constraints, Puyi attempted to assert some measure of independence. He maintained a court and a small group of Chinese officials, seeking to exercise influence over domestic matters when possible. However, these efforts were limited by the constant oversight of Japanese authorities and the structural constraints of the puppet state. His attempts at governance were often overridden or ignored, reinforcing the lesson that titles alone could not guarantee authority. Puyi had to navigate a delicate balance between ceremonial display, compliance with his overseers, and the desire to preserve some sense of dignity and legitimacy. Puyi's personal life in Manchukuo reflected similar tensions. He entered into marriages and formed relationships that were often orchestrated for political purposes. Advisors and Japanese officials sought to shape his household to project a certain image to the public, while Puyi also tried to find companionship and emotional stability within these constraints. Yet the combination of cultural expectation, political oversight, and personal isolation made it difficult for him to form meaningful relationships. He experienced loneliness, frustration, and a sense of disconnection that mirrored his earlier life in the Forbidden City. The juxtaposition of outward grandeur and inner restriction became a defining characteristic of his existence during this period. The role of propaganda in Manchukuo further complicated Puyi's position. Japanese authorities used his image to promote loyalty among the population and to legitimize their military occupation. Photographs, public appearances, and official statements were carefully curated to create the impression of a functioning and autonomous government. Puyi's personal identity was subordinated to this public image, reducing him to a symbol rather than a person. The experience reinforced the tension between appearance and reality that had marked his entire life, emphasized the limits of ceremonial authority when disconnected from real power. International recognition of Manchukuo was limited, which highlighted the precariousness of Puyi's position. Most nations refused to acknowledge the state as legitimate, viewing it as an extension of Japanese imperialism. For Puyi, this lack of global legitimacy underscored the constraints of his role. He held the title of emperor, but few outside the immediate sphere of Japanese control accepted his authority. This reality further reinforced the pattern of symbolic power without practical effect, echoing his early years in the Forbidden City and the failed restoration attempts that had marked his adolescence. The experience in Manchukuo had long-term consequences for Puyi's understanding of governance and personal identity. He became keenly aware of the ways in which political power could be manipulated, how appearances could be used to mask reality, and how his own status could be exploited by those with more tangible authority. This period also demonstrated the vulnerability of rulers whose power was symbolic rather than substantive, a lesson that would inform his later interactions with the Soviet Union and the Communist government of China. The combination of luxury, constraint, and manipulation shaped his worldview and deepened his understanding of the limitations of inherited authority. Puyi's years in Manchukuo ultimately illustrate the paradox of his life. He held a prestigious title and enjoyed extraordinary privileges, yet his actions and decisions were largely dictated by others. He remained a figure of fascination and historical significance, but he lacked the ability to exercise real power. His experiences highlight the complex interplay between symbolism and authority, between personal ambition and external control, and between the remnants of a fallen dynasty and the geopolitical ambitions of foreign powers. The period of his life as a puppet emperor underscores the recurring theme of ceremonial grandeur without true sovereignty, a defining characteristic of his entire biography. Puyi's personal life and relationships were deeply shaped by the extraordinary circumstances of his upbringing and the political environments he inhabited. From his earliest years in the Forbidden City to his later years as a puppet emperor, he lived in settings where personal choice was limited and social interaction was carefully regulated. His relationships were often mediated by advisors, officials, or political interests, which made forming genuine emotional connections difficult. Despite this, Puyi sought companionship, love, and understanding, though the opportunities for authentic connection were rare and often fraught with tension. In the Forbidden City, Puyi's earliest relationships were with palace staff, eunuchs, and a small number of tutors and regents. These figures were simultaneously caretakers and authority figures, responsible for his education, discipline, and well-being, yet also acting to maintain their own influence. His interactions with these individuals were therefore a mixture of affection, dependence, and caution. He learned to navigate a complex social hierarchy, understanding that obedience and performance could earn rewards or prevent punishment, while displays of independence or dissent could have serious consequences. This environment fostered a sense of emotional caution and self-protection that would remain with him throughout his life. Puyi's family relationships were equally complicated. He had limited contact with his parents, and his mother died when he was still young, leaving him with a deep sense of loss and abandonment. His father, Prince Chun, attempted to provide guidance and support, but the constraints of palace life and the political situation often limited the quality of their interactions. The young emperor's family bonds were therefore characterized by both closeness and distance, shaped as much by circumstance as by affection. The absence of normal sibling relationships or peer companionship further isolated him, reinforcing a sense of loneliness and emotional detachment. Marriage and family life became central to Puyi's personal experience as he entered adulthood. His marriages were shaped by political and social expectations, often arranged or encouraged to strengthen alliances or maintain appearances. His first marriage was arranged when he was still very young, and while he attempted to fulfill his duties as husband, the relationships were often formal and distant. Emotional intimacy was difficult to achieve, as his partners, like him, were navigating a highly controlled and public life. These constraints created challenges in forming authentic bonds, leaving Puyi yearning for connection, yet often encountering frustration and disappointment. Beyond his immediate family and spouses, Puyi's relationships extended to advisors, Japanese officials, and other figures in his political orbit. These connections were frequently transactional, driven by political motives rather than personal affection. Japanese officials, for example, cultivated his trust selectively, offering encouragement or comfort when it served their strategic purposes. Puyi had to discern between genuine guidance and manipulation, a skill he developed through repeated exposure to complex power dynamics. This pattern reinforced both his cautiousness and his occasional mistrust, shaping the way he interacted with others throughout his life. Despite these constraints, Puyi sought personal companionship and moments of normalcy whenever possible. He developed friendships with palace staff and younger attendants, although these relationships were limited by hierarchy and surveillance. Even minor acts of play or conversation required careful navigation of protocol. Nevertheless, these interactions provided Puyi with some relief from the rigid and highly controlled environment, offering glimpses of a more ordinary childhood and human connection. Loneliness remained a persistent theme throughout Puyi's life. Even as he gained status and wealth, the social structures surrounding him often amplified his isolation. His elevated position separated him from peers, while the political manipulation he experienced further complicated genuine relationships. Emotional expression was often constrained by fear of judgment or reprisal, and Puyi frequently internalized his frustrations and anxieties. These dynamics contributed to a sense of emotional distance that colored his personal interactions, making trust and intimacy difficult to achieve. The combination of ceremonial expectations and political oversight also shaped Puyi's identity. He learned that his value often lay in appearance rather than substance, and that personal desires could be subordinated to symbolic duties or political agendas. This understanding created tension between his private needs and public role, as he struggled to reconcile the image of the emperor with the reality of his restricted autonomy. Relationships, whether familial, marital, or social, were constantly filtered through these layers of expectation and control. Puyi's personal life was also shaped by the larger historical and cultural changes around him. In Manchukuo, he experienced marriage and social interaction under the watchful eyes of Japanese authorities, who carefully managed his household and public image. Even as he attempted to exercise personal agency, his actions were scrutinized, and his relationships were often politicized. The need to maintain appearances, comply with foreign oversight, and navigate political alliances further complicated his personal connections, emphasizing the tension between private life and public role. Over time, Puyi's personal experiences reflected both the continuity and disruption of his earlier life. The patterns established in childhood, dependence, caution, and awareness of manipulation, continued to influence his adult relationships. The juxtaposition of luxury and confinement, status and powerlessness, persisted, creating ongoing challenges in forming meaningful bonds. Despite these difficulties, Puyi demonstrated resilience in seeking connection, attempting to build a private life within the constraints imposed by history, politics, and culture. His personal relationships, therefore, illustrate a broader theme in Puyi's life: the struggle to assert individuality within structures designed to limit autonomy. From childhood tutors to foreign overseers, from arranged marriages to political advisors, the people around him shaped his behavior, decisions, and identity. Yet, within these constraints, Puyi sought moments of emotional authenticity, reflecting the universal human need for companionship and understanding, even in circumstances of extreme privilege and restriction. The fall of Manchukuo in 1945 marked one of the most dramatic turns in Puyi's life, abruptly ending his role as emperor and leaving him vulnerable to forces far beyond his control. By this time, Japan's position in World War II had deteriorated, and the Soviet Union prepared to invade Manchuria. The Japanese authorities, who had long controlled Puyi's reign as a puppet emperor, were increasingly desperate, and the fragile political structures they had built began to collapse. For Puyi, the events of this period were sudden and overwhelming, highlighting the precariousness of his authority and the vulnerability of relying on foreign power to sustain his position. In August 1945, as Soviet forces launched their invasion of Manchuria, Puyi found himself in a palace that could no longer offer security. The elaborate ceremonial structures that had once made him appear powerful now served only as a gilded enclosure, incapable of protecting him from military reality. Soviet troops quickly advanced, overwhelming the Japanese-controlled administration. Puyi, along with his advisors and retainers, was captured and removed from the palace. His status as emperor held no significance to the Soviets. He was treated as a prisoner of war, a symbol of Japanese manipulation rather than a sovereign ruler. This sudden reversal of fortune exposed the fragility of his entire political career. The experience of captivity was a shock to Puyi. For years, he had lived in carefully managed environments where advisors and overseers controlled his image and movements. Now he was subject to the authority of foreign soldiers and officials who had no interest in ceremonial protocol or deference. His imperial privileges were stripped away, and he was confronted with the reality that his titles and symbols of authority had no practical value outside the political framework that had sustained them. The psychological impact of this loss was profound. Puyi had been trained to associate power with ritual, appearance, and status, and the sudden removal of these elements forced him to confront his own vulnerability. During captivity, Puyi was held under harsh conditions and faced uncertainty about his future. The Soviets interrogated him regarding his role in Manchukuo, his relationships with Japanese authorities, and the political dynamics of the region. Though he was not treated as a high-value prisoner initially, his imperial identity attracted attention from military and political officials who saw him as both a symbol and a source of intelligence. The young man who had once been surrounded by ceremonial grandeur now faced the harsh realities of war and captivity, a dramatic contrast that underscored the limits of symbolic power. This period also highlighted the tension between personal agency and historical forces in Puyi's life. Despite his title and previous privileges, he had little ability to influence events. Decisions about his fate were made entirely by the Soviets, reflecting a pattern that had recurred throughout his life. He was central to political calculations, yet powerless to control them. This experience deepened his awareness of the gap between ceremonial authority and real control, a lesson that would later shape his responses to re-education and reintegration under the communist government. While in captivity, Puyi had time to reflect on the consequences of his choices and the broader forces that had shaped his life. He began to understand that his role as emperor had been largely performative, and that the power he had wielded was contingent upon the ambitions of others. This realization contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment and humility. He recognized that the prestige of his title could not shield him from historical upheaval, nor could it protect him from the practical consequences of war and occupation. The collapse of Manchukuo and his subsequent imprisonment represented a turning point, marking the end of his involvement in governance, even as a symbolic figurehead. The capture by Soviet forces also forced Puyi to confront questions of identity and loyalty. For decades, he had been presented as the legitimate ruler of Manchuria, yet his authority was defined entirely by Japanese interests. Now, stripped of this role, he had to grapple with the reality that his identity as emperor was both politically constructed and historically contingent. This period encouraged introspection, as Puyi considered the ways in which his life had been shaped by manipulation, circumstance, and the expectations of others. The fall of Manchukuo, therefore, was not only a political event but also a personal reckoning. Puyi's captivity lasted for several years, during which he was transported to various locations in the Soviet Union for questioning and observation. The conditions were difficult, and he experienced both physical discomfort and psychological strain. He witnessed firsthand the consequences of imperial and military ambition, gaining a new perspective on the political and military forces that had dominated his life. The transition from emperor to prisoner emphasized the fragility of titles and the dependency of symbolic authority on broader political structures. It also reinforced the recurring theme of vulnerability in Puyi's life. Despite appearances, his fate was always subject to the decisions of more powerful actors. The period also had practical implications for his later life. While in Soviet custody, he was exposed to ideologies and practices that would influence his eventual reintegration into Chinese society. He observed the discipline, organization, and centralized control of the Soviets, contrasting sharply with the ceremonial yet ineffectual governance he had experienced in Manchukuo. These observations provided him with insights into governance and authority that would be relevant when he returned to China under communist rule. By the time Puyi was repatriated to China in 1950, he had been profoundly changed by his experiences. The fall of Manchukuo and his years in captivity had stripped away the illusions of power that had defined his life since childhood. He emerged no longer as a ceremonial ruler or puppet, but as a man confronting the realities of ordinary life and the consequences of historical forces beyond his control. This transformation marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, one defined by adaptation, reflection, and eventual reintegration into society. The fall of Manchukuo and Puyi's subsequent captivity illustrate the recurring pattern of symbolic authority without practical power in his life. For decades, he had been a figurehead, observed, managed, and manipulated by others. Now, he faced the stark consequences of that dependence. The experience underscored the fragility of status and the limits of ceremonial power in the face of historical change. It also prepared him for the re-education and political reintegration that would define the final chapter of his life, emphasizing the enduring tension between personal identity and historical circumstance. After his repatriation to China in 1950, Puyi entered a period of profound personal and social transformation. The new communist government under Mao Zedong had taken power in 1949, and Puyi, once the last emperor of China and a puppet ruler of Manchukuo, was now a citizen subject to the laws and social reforms of a revolutionary state. The transition required him to adjust to a world in which titles, privileges, and ceremonial authority held no meaning. For the first time in his life, he was expected to participate as an ordinary member of society, abide by the rules of a government that had no symbolic use for his imperial identity, and undergo a process of political and ideological rehabilitation. Puyi was placed in the Fushan War Criminals Management Center, a prison in northeastern China, where former officials and collaborators of the Japanese occupation were detained. The early years of his imprisonment were focused on accountability and self-examination. He was subjected to extensive questioning, required to participate in ideological study sessions, and encouraged to reflect on his actions during the years as emperor and puppet ruler. This process was both disciplinary and educational. It forced Puyi to confront the consequences of his choices, the manipulation he had undergone, and the suffering his decisions had contributed to. The experience was challenging, particularly for someone who had spent most of his life insulated by privilege and ceremony. Over time, Puyi began to internalize aspects of the ideological training and political education provided by his captors. He reflected on the historical forces that had shaped his life and recognized the fragility of authority that was dependent on external support. The years of isolation and manipulation had given him insight into human behavior, the nature of power, and the consequences of political loyalty and compromise. While these lessons had been forced upon him, he gradually developed a sense of responsibility and a willingness to adapt to his new environment. The psychological transformation during this period was profound, marking a shift from passive figurehead to self-aware participant in society. Puyi's rehabilitation extended beyond personal reflection to active reintegration into the social and political structures of communist China. Following his release from prison in 1959, he was allowed to live in Beijing as a private citizen. He took up residence in a modest apartment, far removed from the palaces and ceremonial spaces that had defined his earlier life. He participated in work programs and engaged with ordinary citizens, gaining first-hand experience of daily life under the communist government. This period was characterized by discipline, adaptation, and a deliberate effort to leave behind the symbolic and political privileges that had once defined him. Education and employment became central to Puyi's new life. He took courses, learned practical skills, and engaged in professional work that was consistent with the egalitarian values promoted by the Communist Party. He worked in various capacities, including as a gardener and later in administrative positions, contributing to society in tangible ways rather than performing ceremonial duties. These activities helped him establish a sense of purpose and belonging outside of the trappings of royalty. Puyi's ability to adapt to ordinary work reflected his resilience and his gradual acceptance of a new identity, one divorced from imperial grandeur. Socially, Puyi cultivated relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical status. He interacted with colleagues, neighbors, and fellow citizens in ways that were largely egalitarian, a stark contrast to the rigid protocols of the Forbidden City or the controlled environment of Manchukuo. He developed friendships and professional connections, gradually integrating into a society that had no use for his former imperial authority. These relationships offered emotional support, a sense of community, and opportunities to participate meaningfully in social life. For Puyi, learning to relate to others as an equal rather than as a figure of reverence was both challenging and transformative. The ideological dimension of Puyi's rehabilitation was also significant. He publicly reflected on his past mistakes, acknowledged the consequences of his actions under Japanese manipulation, and expressed alignment with the principles of the new government. While some of these statements were initially shaped by political necessity, over time he internalized many of the values promoted by the Communist Party, including the importance of equality, social responsibility, and national unity. This ideological adaptation allowed him to reconcile his past with his present, transforming a life once dominated by inherited privilege into one compatible with the expectations of modern society. Culturally, Puyi also contributed to historical understanding and public memory. He participated in interviews, lectures, and publications that recounted his experiences as the last emperor, providing insights into the Qing dynasty, Manchukuo, and the social and political transformations of China during the 20th century. Through these contributions, he became a bridge between history and the present, helping citizens and scholars understand the complexities of China's past. His role in public education was both symbolic and practical, allowing him to maintain relevance in a society that no longer recognized him as a ruler but valued his perspective on historical events. Puyi's personal development during this period was profound. He gained humility, empathy, and an appreciation for the challenges faced by ordinary citizens. The contrast between his early life of ceremonial privilege and his later life as a worker and citizen fostered a sense of groundedness and realism. He learned to navigate social norms without relying on authority, to form relationships without hierarchical advantage, and to find meaning in daily work and community engagement. This transformation reflected both the efficacy of the rehabilitation process and Puyi's own capacity for reflection and adaptation. Health and family life also played a role in his reintegration. Puyi remarried, establishing a household in line with ordinary social norms rather than political or ceremonial imperatives. He devoted time to family responsibilities, balancing personal care with civic participation. The shift from symbolic ruler to citizen and family man represented a complete reorientation of his identity, demonstrating the possibility of personal reinvention even after decades defined by political manipulation and ceremonial confinement. By the 1960s and 1970s, Puyi had become an example of successful rehabilitation in communist China. His life demonstrated the potential for personal transformation, social reintegration, and adaptation to modern political and social structures. From child emperor to puppet ruler, prisoner, and finally citizen, Puyi's trajectory illustrated the interplay between historical forces, personal resilience, and social reform. His experiences underscored the importance of both accountability and opportunity in the process of reintegration. Puyi's life in communist China stands as a testament to the adaptability of human identity in the face of radical historical change. Stripped of imperial authority, he rebuilt his life through work, reflection, and social participation. He reconciled a complex past with the demands of a modern society, transforming from a symbolic figurehead into an engaged citizen. This period not only marked the final stage of his personal transformation, but also offered a broader lesson about the limits of inherited power, the importance of personal agency, and the potential for renewal even after profound disruption. Puyi's legacy and historical significance are deeply intertwined with the dramatic transformations China experienced during the 20th century. As the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, he represents the final chapter of a political and cultural system that had endured for over 2 millennia. His life spans the fall of imperial China, the rise of republicanism, the turmoil of foreign occupation, and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. This unique trajectory makes Puyi a figure of extraordinary historical interest, not only as a ruler in name, but also as a participant and witness to some of the most transformative events in modern Chinese history. One aspect of Puyi's legacy is symbolic. As the last emperor, he embodied the continuity of imperial tradition even as the structures that supported it collapsed. His early life in the Forbidden City, surrounded by ritual, wealth, and strict hierarchy, represented the last vestiges of a centuries-old system. To many, he symbolized both the grandeur and rigidity of the Qing dynasty, a living link to a past that was quickly receding. Historians and the public have often viewed him as a figure caught between eras, a child raised to be a ruler who never exercised real power, and whose life reflects the broader tensions between tradition and modernity in China. Puyi's role as a puppet emperor in Manchukuo further complicates his historical significance. His involvement in a state controlled by Japanese interests has often led to debates about collaboration, responsibility, and agency. While he did not independently wield power, his presence lent legitimacy to the Japanese occupation, making him a controversial figure in the eyes of Chinese nationalists and historians. At the same time, Puyi's lack of autonomy highlights the limits of symbolic authority and the ways in which individuals can be manipulated by larger political forces. His life in Manchukuo serves as a case study in the interaction between personal identity, coercion, and historical circumstance. Another element of Puyi's legacy is his personal transformation and eventual reintegration into communist China. After decades of ceremonial privilege, political manipulation, and imprisonment, Puyi adapted to life as an ordinary citizen. His participation in ideological education, work programs, and social integration exemplifies the broader goals of the communist government in rehabilitating former elites and collaborators. Through this process, he demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and the capacity for reflection, turning a life once defined by privilege into one that could offer lessons on accountability, personal growth, and societal participation. This aspect of his legacy resonates with contemporary discussions about forgiveness, transformation, and the reconciliation of personal and historical responsibility. Culturally, Puyi's life has had enduring influence. He became the subject of memoirs, interviews, and historical studies that provided insight into both the Qing dynasty and the turbulent years of the 20th century. His autobiography, detailing his experiences from childhood to reintegration into society, became a significant source for scholars and the public, offering a rare first-person account of imperial life, political manipulation, and social transformation. Through these accounts, Puyi contributed to the preservation of historical memory, helping subsequent generations understand the complexities of China's transition from empire to republic, through occupation, and finally to communist rule. The historical significance of Puyi also extends to the broader narrative of power, legitimacy, and the relationship between individuals and state structures. His life demonstrates how authority can be symbolic rather than substantive, how personal agency can be constrained by political forces, and how historical change can render once powerful institutions obsolete. Puyi's experiences illustrate the human dimension of political transformation, highlighting the personal consequences of events that are often described in abstract terms in history books. His story reminds us that historical shifts are experienced not only at the level of society or government, but also at the level of individual lives, shaped by circumstance, culture, and chance. Puyi's legacy is further reflected in modern media and popular culture. Films, documentaries, and novels have explored his life, emphasizing the dramatic contrasts between childhood privilege, political manipulation, and eventual ordinary citizenship. These portrayals often focus on the paradoxes inherent in his existence. A ruler without power, a figurehead used by foreign occupiers, and a man who transitioned from royalty to a citizen of a radically transformed nation. While interpretations vary, they consistently highlight the tensions between history, identity, and personal agency that define his life. Politically, Puyi's story has served as a lens through which scholars and the public examine questions of collaboration, sovereignty, and national identity. His role in Manchukuo, often framed as complicity with Japanese imperialism, invites reflection on the nature of coercion and choice in situations of extreme political pressure. Conversely, his later life demonstrates the capacity for rehabilitation and societal reintegration, suggesting that historical judgment can be nuanced, recognizing both the constraints and responsibilities that shaped his decisions. In this sense, Puyi's life serves as a case study in the intersection of individual morality, historical circumstance, and political accountability. Puyi also represents the emotional and psychological consequences of living under prolonged ceremonial authority without real power. From his early years in the Forbidden City to his role in Manchukuo, he experienced the isolation, manipulation, and pressures that accompany symbolic positions. His life illustrates the impact of an upbringing focused on ritual and status rather than personal development, highlighting the ways in which institutional structures shape identity and interpersonal relationships. The psychological dimension of his legacy offers lessons on the human costs of rigid hierarchies, the fragility of inherited authority, and the challenges of navigating transitions between radically different social and political systems. Puyi's story emphasizes resilience and adaptation. Despite a life marked by confinement, political manipulation, imprisonment, and social reintegration, he managed to carve out a new identity as a citizen of modern China. His journey from child emperor to puppet ruler, prisoner, and ordinary citizen demonstrates the capacity for personal growth and the potential for reconciliation with history. This aspect of his legacy resonates not only within China but globally, offering a human story within the broader sweep of historical transformation, showing how individuals can navigate the tension between inherited circumstance and personal choice. Puyi's historical significance is therefore multifaceted. He symbolizes the end of imperial China, the consequences of political manipulation, and the possibilities of personal rehabilitation. He bridges historical epochs, providing a tangible link between the Qing dynasty, Japanese occupation, and communist China. His life illustrates the complexities of authority, identity, and historical change, offering lessons in both the fragility and resilience of human experience. By examining Puyi's story, historians and the public gain insight into the forces that shape history and the ways in which individuals navigate the extraordinary circumstances of their times. His legacy continues to influence contemporary understanding of Chinese history, demonstrating the intersection of personal narrative with national transformation. Puyi's life, full of paradox and dramatic turns, remains a compelling study of power, vulnerability, and adaptation. It highlights the interplay between symbolism and reality, privilege and responsibility, coercion and choice. In both historical scholarship and popular memory, he serves as a reminder that history is experienced by individuals as much as it is shaped by institutions and movements, making his life an enduring subject of study, reflection, and cultural resonance. Puyi's life, from his early days as the last emperor of the Qing dynasty to his later years as a citizen of communist China, illustrates a remarkable journey through the dramatic transformations of modern Chinese history. His experiences encapsulate the end of imperial rule, the upheavals of foreign occupation, the consequences of political manipulation, and the challenges of personal rehabilitation. The trajectory of his life provides both a unique historical perspective and a deeply human story, revealing how one individual navigates the intersections of power, identity, and circumstance. The conclusion of Puyi's story is not simply about the end of an era, but also about adaptation and survival. As a child emperor, he inherited a system of authority that was already fragile and increasingly irrelevant. Despite the grandeur of the Forbidden City and the pageantry of his coronation, he held no real power and was largely a symbol of a collapsing dynasty. His early life established patterns that would define him for decades: dependence on advisors, awareness of manipulation, and the need to navigate complex social hierarchies. These formative experiences shaped his understanding of authority, personal agency, and the limits of ceremonial power. His tenure as a puppet emperor in Manchukuo underscores the paradoxical nature of his life. Elevated to the throne by Japanese forces, he appeared to wield influence, yet all meaningful decisions were controlled by foreign officials. This period highlighted the dangers of symbolic authority detached from practical power, emphasizing the vulnerability of individuals who are manipulated for political purposes. Puyi's experience in Manchukuo also illustrates broader themes in history, including the exploitation of legitimacy for political gain, the consequences of foreign intervention, and the complexities of personal responsibility under coercive circumstances. The collapse of Manchukuo and Puyi's subsequent captivity by the Soviet Union marked a turning point. Stripped of status, wealth, and ceremonial authority, he was forced to confront the realities of vulnerability and dependence. His imprisonment, interrogation, and reflection during this period were transformative, providing him with an understanding of the consequences of his actions and the limitations of inherited power. The experience emphasized the fragility of symbolic authority and demonstrated how historical forces can abruptly overturn personal circumstances, regardless of previous status or privilege. Puyi's eventual rehabilitation in communist China represents both personal and historical reconciliation. Through ideological education, work, and social integration, He transformed from a former ruler and collaborator into a citizen participating in the life of a modern nation. This period of his life highlights the possibilities for adaptation, accountability, and personal growth. It also demonstrates the capacity of societies to reintegrate individuals who once occupied positions of privilege or complicity, reflecting broader themes of justice, reform, and social transformation. An essential aspect of Puyi's life is the interplay between personal identity and historical circumstance. Throughout his life, he navigated environments in which appearances, titles, and symbolism were often more important than real authority. From the Forbidden City to Manchukuo and finally to the Society of Communist China, he confronted the tension between who he was expected to be and who he could actually become. This tension shaped his character, influenced his decisions, and provides historians with a window into the human dimensions of political and social change. Puyi's story also emphasizes the role of resilience and adaptation. Despite repeated upheavals, loss of authority, and periods of isolation, he managed to survive, learn, and ultimately find a place in a society that had once excluded him. His ability to adjust to circumstances, reflect critically on his past, and engage constructively in his later years exemplifies human adaptability in the face of historical and personal disruption. The narrative of his life serves as a reminder that survival and transformation often require both reflection and willingness to change, even after decades shaped by rigid hierarchies and coercion. The broader historical significance of Puyi lies in the lessons his life offers about power, legitimacy, and the human consequences of political change. As the last emperor, he symbolizes the end of a millennia-long system of monarchy. His time in Manchukuo shows the limits of authority when it is co-opted by external powers, while his rehabilitation demonstrates the potential for reconciliation and reintegration. Together, these experiences provide insight into the dynamics of history, illustrating how institutions, politics, and social forces shape individual lives. Puyi's story allows for reflection on both the fragility and resilience of human existence within the sweep of historical change. Puyi's life invites reflection on the personal costs of historical upheaval. He endured isolation, manipulation, public scrutiny, and repeated losses of status and autonomy. Yet he also experienced opportunities for personal growth, engagement with society, and reflection on the past. The balance between these elements offers a nuanced understanding of history as lived experience. Puyi's journey is a reminder that historical narratives are not only shaped by institutions, wars, or governments, but by the individuals who experience, navigate, and respond to these forces. Puyi's life stands as both a historical document and a human story. It encapsulates the end of imperial China, the effects of foreign occupation, the consequences of symbolic authority, and the potential for adaptation and rehabilitation. His experiences demonstrate the complex interplay between power and vulnerability, tradition and modernity, and personal identity and societal expectation. By examining Puyi's journey from child emperor to citizen of a transformed China, we gain insight not only into the history of the nation, but also into the resilience, adaptability, and complexity of the human spirit.